Hello, I'd like to welcome you to iNN's Headline News and Beyond for April 5th, 2012. A little bit of a disclaimer here that we come to you about a day after the actual headlines appear because we do need the time. We're not here simply to bring you the headlines, to be a mouthpiece or whatever. We're here to give you some insight into what's actually going on behind the scenes so that you can get a proper understanding of what's actually going on and then make your own decisions. As I've stated before, every broadcast, every reporter out there, no matter how unbiased they say they are, and this includes myself, has a degree of bias. And while we can go and analyze others' biases, you've got to sit down and do the research eventually yourself. And this is why I put up some documentaries that I've put up by Daniel Yergin. Again, another perspective on these issues here. This is particularly on the issue of oil and how oil impacts and affects a lot of the policy and politics that go on in this one. Oil has been behind a lot of the major policies, including major historical events in the world. And it's not simply it's not something that sort of, oh, it's oil and just sort of leave it alone. But if you watch this documentary, even though again it's from one person's perspective, and there's more that could be gotten into as a primer, as a reference, as a beginning point, this is a great place to start. So, with that being said, because we are dealing now we're in the primary, we're going to the presidential race. We hear a lot about constitutional issues, about rights issues, and so on and so forth. So I thought that it would be good if we begin with, I said I've picked out three amendments from the Constitution, from the Bill of Rights, that sort of sum up a large chunk of the issues that we see today, and are going to be playing a significant role in the coming election, because you'll see this trotted out on both sides. The first one is the First Amendment, and this is the one everyone knows is free speech. But it's more than just free speech. It includes freedom of religion, freedom of thought. It's an encompassing thing that gives the basis for all other freedoms, sits in the First Amendment. And this is why the First Amendment is so important, because it is the basis from which all other freedoms stem. And it states, and this is our particular point, is that we're not only do we have a freedom of religion, and it says here specifically, and I read this the way it comes out, and this is for freedom of speech. It says, as Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Well, if you've been watching both sides of this argument, particularly on the Trayvon Martin case, you'll know they've been talking about certain words, and there is the N word that they can't say on the air, or this word. There are now words that cannot be said on the air because of the political censorship that's going on from the left, from the Social Democrats, and this is their proper term because they have moved enough to the left. They are in the Social Democrat definition. And a large chunk of their rhetoric includes a restriction of terms that they consider to be insensitive to a particular group who face certain issues. And it's really based on perception, not in any reality, because once again, this whole thing of hate speech and hate crime, and this is what you'll hear from the social left, and this is Obama, this is Al Sharpton, and a lot of the arguments you'll hear on CNN, and as I checked on MSNBC, and Bill O'Reilly was right, MSNBC, so what I've seen so far, is significantly to the left. They're not just a little bit to the left, they're significantly to the left. They'll talk about hate speech, hate crime, but hate speech and hate crime only applies to uh, a certain segment of the population called visible minorities. There are other minorities out there who are invisible, but only these visible minorities are entitled to have these special protections. It's not that the other invisible minorities are sort of well off or not under threat. It just the ruling elite of the social left, the intellectuals, feel that these are the representative groups that they want to pay attention to, and they really don't. And this is true to a large extent. They don't see the other minorities. These other minorities are invisible to them. They have no concept or understanding of these other minorities outside of the so-called visible minority spectrum. And as I said, a large chunk of the social left comes from this sort of Western thought intellectual base, and this is sort of what you'll hear a lot about this, about the intellectual left, about the intellectual elite, and their views. And it's a bizarre view, because although they are elite, although they are silver spooned, they try to pretend that they have a commonality with the average man, with the average person. And the thing is, it doesn't matter whether or not at one point in time you were at a particular position. It's the position and the way you think now, as you're speaking to things, that really matter. Because if you have rejected everything you had in the past, you hide who you were in the past, being viewed as, because you sometimes maybe view it as being ignorant or uneducated and so on and so forth, then there is a whole segment of society that is rejected along with it. And a lot of the academic left, and the left is primarily academic or view themselves as academic, have this sort of locked-in mentality where their reality, which is the academic world, and because that's their reality, the outside world seems nonsensical and illogical to them. And they will represent and describe what they have not experienced in these derogatory and often offensive terms, as a sort of an attempt. It's basically, if you want to get down to the very simple nitty-gritty of it, the left uses their intelligence, or their perceived intelligence, to bully the right, or those who disagree with their own thoughts and beliefs, as ignorant, uneducated, moronic, and they will even use the term rural, country bumpkin. The Greeks have a term horiatica, meaning village-minded, and it's used as a derogatory. It's a negative. It's an offensive term designed to denigrate and belittle the person that you think is not as significant as you are. In other words, you have a particular intelligent position that the person beneath you in this village doesn't have. You start calling him these particular village terms. And the left is, as much as they are against cyberbullying and talk about inclusions, they are the first people in their speech, and you can see this all over the news, who will immediately step into this sort of verbal assault, degrading those who do not think like they do. Now, the Republicans, who never pretended or assumed themselves to be inclusive, they were predominantly white. They were predominantly, what they considered to be Christian, even though functionally speaking, the Christian right really isn't Christian. There's a huge contradiction with the Christian right in that if you go back and you study the early texts of Christianity in the original Greek form, because it came out of the Roman Empire at the time where Greek was the common language. It's not that it was a locally Greek thing. It was that it was more of what they call an international Greek language that was common all across the area of the Middle East and somewhat into Europe, although not too far into Europe. Most of Europe at the time of the early Christian church very simply just didn't exist. There was no civilization there. The European civilization wouldn't begin and evolve until almost 1,000 years afterwards. So what a lot of the Christian right consists to be Christianity is something that evolved 1,000 years afterwards and is based and rooted not in the original Eastern Christianity, but in the Western Christianity that evolved 1,000 years afterwards. So the Christian right is a European Christianity, where the original Christianity was not a European Christianity. European Christianity and the original Christianity are fundamentally different. There are fundamental differences between the two. That in many cases, if you get into the theology, you can see that the theologies in many cases are contradictory and place certain limits and restrictions that didn't exist if you looked at the original theology. One example of this is the focus on law and order and of the importance of government and the importance and adherence to law. They're talking about the Ten Commandments as the laws, and the way they adhere to it back. And what they'll do is that the Western right, the Christian right, will almost exclusively exclude the first 1,000 years of Christianity and skip all the way back to the Old Testament to find a lot of the justifications for the different ways they believe about how people should be treated when they are sinners. The problem with that is if you look at what occurred in the first 1,000 years of Christianity, you'll find that the treatment of these sinners was actually contradictory to what we see in the West. For example, you as an early Christian, because Christianity was a matter of free will, you could never force somebody at a point of a sword into Christianity. Because love can't be forced. It's something that has to grow and needs to be organic. You cannot force it on somebody or impose it on somebody. It can't be forced or imposed. It needs to be an organic growth. And if you look even into, you look at this writing by some of these early historians like Bede, and you can find these in Penguin Classics and a lot of the classics, and look at the classical history of England, and you'll find that what they call the conversion of the English people, not to be in the style of what we consider to be Western conversion. It's more of an Eastern style conversion, where people weren't forced to be anything. What they did is the people moved into the area, the Christians moved into the area, these particular monks and so moved into the area, and they lived about their daily lives. And as people asked the questions, well, what are you, who are you, what do you believe, they answered the questions. And so the witness to Christianity was themselves and their own behaviors. This is contradicted by the conversions that you see today, the concept of conversion that you see today, particularly in the Christians, where they're out there screaming at you. And in the early part of the Western Christianity, when you have the Crusades, and you see the Roman Catholic Church riding into areas, conquering them, and forcing the people in the area under their brand of Christianity. This is what you can see this in the Crusades. You can see this in the Battle of Hastings. There is a whole history behind this that leads into why the Christian right particularly when the Republicans behave the way they do. But that you can argue, if you go into the full history of Christianity, you can say that this is contradictory to the first 1,000 years. And this is why that first 1,000 years is more often than not sort of done away with. It's sort of tossed out. And most of the evangelical right, when they do their Bible studies, will go right back to the Old Testament, and you'll hear a lot of quotations, particularly from the Old Testament, rather than going to a lot of the church doctrines, a lot of the church books, and there are a lot of church books still around from the first 1,000 years. A lot of these first books seem to be basically tossed out by the Christian right, and a lot of these books have a completely and fundamentally different way of dealing with personal moral issues. Now, this doesn't, and the thing is, just because there's a different way of dealing with the personal moral issues, that doesn't mean that that Christianity has ever condoned moral lapses. And moral lapses, again, become an important component of theology, because how theology defines how you believe, your belief in God. Your morals are based in this, and then your morals determine what laws you consider to be just and unjust. So there is a context to which laws in society sit in, and that is theology, morality, and then constitutionality, then legality. This is the context that things sit in. If you are a theist, or a person who believes in God, and you have a theology that's specific to a god or many gods, then your morality will evolve from this, and then the laws subsequently and the constitutionality will evolve as well from that. If you are and these laws will be specific. There will be specific things to the theology that you can be seen in the law. And this is why between different theology, but let's say between the Catholics and the Protestants, you have this war. And this is a lot was fought in Ireland over these things, between the Protestants and the Roman Catholics, over how these laws would and should be shaped. This is the argument and the cause of conflict between the various different Muslim groups. When you see Muslim bombing Muslims, the issue is based on this concept of morality that stems from their understanding of their theology. Consequently, when we look at the social left, who are fundamentally atheistic and view everything as a concept, then their morality is no longer an individual morality or a set morality, but rather a social morality. And for them, they believe in social justice. And it's the social issues that drive their issues of the day. And that can be a variety of things, and as one issue lapses and another issue come up, their morality changes with the changes in the views and perspectives of society, and so far, and so in the way you can define them, their definition, this meets the definition of an amoral or a pluralistically moral person, a person who has multiple and even contradictory morals. This means in some cases it will be fine to murder and massacre people, while in other cases, because it's against that morality of the day, it is not not okay to murder and massacre another group. So you can have one group over here who are socially moral and to murder and kill, and then you have, on the other hand, you can have a group who's not socially acceptable to murder and kill. And this forms the morality of social justice. And this can be seen in the case when we go back to Rachel Maddow, and this is the show that I looked at from MSNBC, that when the Republicans are out there fighting against the law on abortion, and this is the fault of the Republicans themselves now. They don't come out and state specifically why they're against the law of why they're against abortion. They don't come out and state and call their opponents who are supporting abortion murderers. But this is exactly what people who support abortion are. They're murderers. You're killing people based on a social standard or a social moral. And I'll give you an example. In socialism, you look at the history of socialism. You look at Hitler. You look at Stalin. You look at the leaders of the Khmer Rouge. And you can place Obama and a lot of the socialist leaders. And this is where Bill O'Reilly will say the wrong thing to do is to demonize Obama. Well, you don't have to demonize him. All you have to do is place him within the context of history. And if you understand the context in which history, and particularly socialism, evolved in history, then you will see that Hitler and Stalin had defined groups of people who were defective and socially acceptable to murder. This is what I'm talking about. In every social society, because socialism is geared and based on this concept of a global socialist utopia, a correction and a engineering of society, there are certain groups within the society and individuals who are sacrificed for the benefit or the greater good of society. This is the fundamental tenet of socialism. And when you're hearing someone talk about social justice and any of these other social causes or the socially relevant issues of the day, this is at the basis of their belief. And this is why when you heard and this wasn't publicized in a lot of the mainstream American media, but it was out in some of the foreign media that you could sort of find this out. And a lot of the information you can't find in the American media. You have to go outside to other foreign sources to find, even when they're talking about stuff that's going on in the United States. And this is one of the things is that we had CNN's Jeffrey Toobin on Anderson Cooper, another sort of a creative journalist who creates his own stories, was talking about how absurd it was to call Obama's comments about the Supreme Court, attacking the Supreme Court and the justices on the Supreme Court. Yet, if you went into the BBC and all the papers across the UK, you went into Al Jazeera, into all these other papers, and all the other news sources around the world, even the Bangkok Times called Obama's actions an attack on the Supreme Court of Justice. So so what happens is that you have a lot of journalistic creationism going on within the American media, and a lot of the stories that are supposed to get out don't get out or are belittled in such a manner that one of the manners of sort of dismissing arguments is, rather than actually presenting a solid, good argument with a good historical backing, a good historical context, what they'll do is they'll simply dismiss it and treat it as a as a comical or a amusing issue, and they'll laugh it off as and the dismissal, the counter argument is this laughing, mocking dismissal. And this is exactly what Rachel Maddow does. Is she talks about the issue of abortion as an attack on women, but it's not an attack on women. The issue of abortion is an attack on the human being. It's just at this particular point in time, under Obama, rather than having the human being defined that is acceptable to be eliminated, being a Jew, it's now a baby. And you can see again through all these different socialist values there, throughout the socialist history, one group or another have always been defined as subhuman or not sufficient or beneficial to the greater society, and therefore therefore is a moral imperative that we eliminate this minority in order that be better or for progress. And this is why in many cases the socialists, the social left, are also called progressives, because their goal is the progression of society and social values in this great socialist utopia. And what Obama is guilty of is he's guilty of supporting and working with those who have dehumanized the human life within the womb, and it is a separate entity. And the thing is, I am going to say here, because again, Rachel Maddow says that most Republicans, that Republicans are people who are against science, and no, they're not against science. I'm not necessarily a Republican. I'm on the right. I'm a Christian, but I'm not of the European Christian. I'm of the Eastern Christian variety. I'm part of the invisible minority that I've been talking about. And the thing is, I'm also an astrophysicist, and I know that inside from my medical research experience that the life in the womb is a separate entity, and that there is a discussion, because we still don't know when this life is sufficiently independent to say that this is a life and it can be gotten rid of. Because there's also an argument, and again, the academic elite who argue that we we have no God, there is no God, and that human beings have no soul. The issue comes out is that when does the soul enter into the body? At what point in time not are you only killing the physical material of the body, but are you killing the soul as well? I mean, in terms of the actions that occur against the person. And all this argument, and this is again the abortion argument, doesn't have to be brought back to a Christian point. All you have to do is go back to Hippocrates in ancient Greece, who was an idolater. He believed in the 12 gods of Olympus, and you can see right there in the writing of Hippocrates, the Hippocratic Oath, that all medical physicians, any doctor takes who goes into becomes an MD, specifically curses any medical doctor who takes a life, including those of the baby that is still within the womb. So this is not a Christian document. This is a non-Christian document. This is a idol worshiper, an idolater, but a doctor at that, saying that this is morally wrong. And the thing is, the social left, unfortunately, does not have history on its side. It cannot turn to history and say, "Here's where I stand, and here is how my ideas are supported in history," because they have to toss away history. Their views and their social values are ambiguous and don't stand in any one particular way or another, because everything is viewed as a concept. Yet what Rachel Maddow does is simply belittle and in an arrogant manner just simply toss off the opposition, the Republican opposition, as laughable and clownish. In other words, there is what I said in earlier as the left's derogatory manner towards anything and anyone who does not believe the way they do. This is exactly what's represented in Rachel Maddow's show. It's throughout the entire show. There's not even an attempt to bring in any form of proper balance at all. Where if you go to Bill O'Reilly's show, he doesn't go. He's not, even though he does have his tendencies and he does have his biases, they're not in the same manner that you see that I've seen in Rachel Maddow's show. So when he calls MSNBC, and I also found the quote from the Associated Press, that there is a bias there and that there is a media push for socialism. You can say that it's true, but I can also show you that historically this has always been true. The love of the press for the social left, for socialism, has always been there. There is a historical connection between socialism, communism, and your average reporter. And it's something that can be seen in history, and I will, at some point in time, pull all the information that I have here together in my library and produce a little documentary showing the connection between the left and the reporters. Anyways, we're going to go on to our second half now. I will see you on the other side in a few minutes. Welcome back to iNN's, the second half of iNN's Headlines and Beyond for March, for April 5th, April 5th, 2005. As I was saying, and I think you're beginning to see this now, that events in the news are not isolated. They have an enormous historical context, and to a certain degree they have a philosophical and theological context as well. And when I talk about theological, I'm not talking specifically about any particular theology. Excuse me. I'm talking about theology in general, whether it's a theology where there's a belief in no God, whether it's agnosticism, where there is a belief in some God, but there is no real certainty to which God there is, sort of a blind understanding of God, to monotheism and polytheism. These are all theologies. And throughout history, we've had civilizations grow out of all these various different forms of theologies. You've seen in these histories, we've seen constitutions come out of them. We've seen governments come out of them. We've seen laws come out of them. We've seen wars and an enormous amount of barbarity come out of them. And the question as we move forward is, how do we create a more peaceful society? And this has sort of always been the question, building a more, something that's a better, what we consider to be a better society without as much of the horrors that we are currently seeing around us. And this was certainly no less of an important issue to Buddha, who was a prince in India, looking at what was going on around him, when he sort of began and started seeking his understanding of the world around him and trying to make things a better place, and sort of gave birth to Buddhism. Although what we see as Buddhism today is not necessarily the original, but rather many reformations and regenerations of Buddhism, including, well, their regenerations are more often than not, formed from an interpretation of and perception of a philosophy rather than the actual philosophy or theology itself. And this is certainly not lost in terms of its context for socialism. Socialism has its own intellectual leaders that things have come from and have been interpreted and reinterpreted and reinterpreted again, and to the point where we can actually call President Obama, we can call him Master Obama, because he still has slaves under him. Because as a socialist, if you're on the social left, you believe the government is the one that does everything. Even though you may believe you're benign and being beneficial, you still have this control over people, this legal control over people, that because you create the law yourself, that bonds and indentures the citizen to the state. So the state, if you believe in Obama, and a lot of people do believe in Obama and his ideals of social left, then what you're heading for is you're heading for a state of slavery, under which the state will determine what you could have based on their understanding of what is fair and what's not fair. And the thing is that the argument from the left, and in particularly Obama, is that things will be different this time. And what does he mean by things will be different this time? Well, the last time this is more or less tried out was the Soviet Union, and we saw the gulags, we saw the death camps. We saw all these the various treatments, the mental hospitals, all these different things that were done in the name of the social ideal in there. We saw what happened under Mao. We saw what happened in Burma and the way people were treated in Burma. The so-called, and we even see this today. If you look at North Korea, if you look at the people who were the reality of the people starving to death in North Korea, being left to die on the streets, and you hear the rhetoric of this great leader who is living in luxury, then you can see yourself that in history, that history shows that socialism is a lie, and a lot of what Obama's talking about is a lie. And even though he set himself up, and this is in many cases the way you have with many of the people who support him, are set up in these positions of egalitarianism, these very elegant and how should we phrase this? Very misogynistic positions. Like, if you're a TV show host and you're enjoying being a TV show host and you're out there telling people how they should and shouldn't live, in terms of that you're promoting a socialist society, and in many cases in history it can be shown that the left has for years been associated with the writers of journalism, and the journalism has had this connection to the left for a long time. This isn't something new. This is something that's historical. That when they are given this position of renown and recognition, that these positions that they support by people who pay them the money that they pay, because in many cases, when you're dealing with a socialist issue, the state comes in the way it did for GM and a lot of the other car companies. They buy up the car company, and it's the government taxes, the government funding that comes in and pays everybody. And when the government is your funder, the person who pays your salary, the more money he gives you, the happier you are. And so you're not going to more often not turn around and say, "No, thank you. I want to be free. I'm going to go out and be poor." And so when you have people who are in the media getting paid the money they're getting paid now for violating free speech with the DCA, and remember the First Amendment, what the First Amendment says. The First Amendment is very clear in this. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. And yet what does the DCA do? And there is now push from Chris Dodd, who is now a Hollywood person now. He is no longer the darling of the Democratic Party, but he's still a darling of the left and one of its major saints. He is pushing for Hollywood. He's he's a Hollywood lobbyist, pushing for a law that would lock off the CNN, lock off the internet, and create a huge chunk of censorship. He is part of Viacom's attack on YouTube, so that what it calls its intellectual property, which is basically a lie, is simply a means to control thought and the social media content that's out there. So if these socialists come out and say something like on MSNBC has a lot of their stuff locked off, and you can't really get at it in terms of criticizing it. And if you do try to criticize it, MSNBC will take you to court and sue you for DCA copyright infringement. This is censorship. It's not anything else. This is censorship, and it violates the First Amendment that says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Very simple. And we know that YouTube has been used for dissident reasons, that YouTube has been used to get sensitive information out about revolutions, and dissidents will put up their videos there. So it's not lost on Viacom that YouTube is actually part of the press now, and is covered under the First Amendment. But this is, again, this is completely ignored, and I'm pretty sure the courts will completely ignore this as well. And even the people who argue for YouTube may not argue the First Amendment issue, because in many cases YouTube itself will end up turning around and using the DCA for its own particular purposes. And if you're going to do that, and this is what a lot of the copyleft laws do, the copyleft arguments and the Creative Commons licenses are all based on this concept, not of the First Amendment, but acting against the corporate interests of making money off this stuff. But they still believe in the concept of intellectual property. So the copyleft, the GNU, the CC, Creative Commons, are not free speech. They don't encompass this concept of Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. This is not encompassed in there. What does occur, and as I said before, we can see this as it comes out. We can see that a lot of this sort of smugness that comes in from the left plays out in the global stage through the UN, particularly when you have a Democrat in power like Obama, because everything is done under the symbol of the UN. But the UN, in terms of its behavior, is very white in its origins. And I refer you back to the definition of several that did last video and a few other videos, that white is not a color specific thing, but it's a cultural specific thing. And that there is a culture that includes Obama and Oprah and all these other people that are considered to be white in terms of their culture, because they're more Western in their thought and their ideals and their intellectual behavior, that pits them against the cultures that are not white and European. And this includes some of the Asian cultures. This includes some of the, some of what I call the invisible minority cultures. If you're part of what they call the visible minority, and that's defined in these hate crime laws and the hate speech issues, then you're all right. But in some ways, but you have to be grateful and thankful to your masters and overlords who are granting you this right to be in among the significant or the visible minorities. And that means you're all right for society. If you're not part of these groups, like unborn children, children who are within the womb, then you don't matter and you can be killed. And this can easily be seen in the UN, when the ICC just recently turned its back on the Palestinian people and walked away as Palestinians are being killed and murdered in Israel. Everyone's talking about two-state solution, but this whole concept that's in the UN about any group who wants to stand up and say, I have a grievance, I need to be separate from everybody else, okay, so let's give them a state, has created so much turmoil in Africa that it's unbelievable. Most of the conflict that's still going on in Africa today is based on this whole thing of separatism. If you read, I was looking at the issues going on in Mali. Mali is, again, it had its coup that overthrew the government that wasn't paying enough attention to a lot of the issues that were going on in Mali. And one of the issues that are going on in Mali is across Africa, and this is common across, you're having these groups, these Islamist groups, going around bombing places. And we've known for a long time now that, and this is through the U.S. intelligence reports and a lot of these intelligence reports that are coming out, that Al-Qaeda is making a move into Africa. This is not surprising, because we see this in Somalia, we see this in Uganda, we see it all across Africa. But what we're seeing is we're seeing a socialist value being put in there that splits these areas up into small independent regions, and it fuels in the policy of granting every separatist group its own domain, it's fueling division. It's dividing the people in Africa, and you're getting a lot of warfare in Africa over these divisions being created by the UN. And this is no exception in Mali now, where Mali looks like it's heading towards another separatist war, just the way we're seeing in Libya now. We had Muammar Gaddafi, who was installed by the United States into Libya to stabilize Libya so they can get the oil out of Libya. The policy changed in 1990 that wanted to bring in an Israeli-style democracy into these military dictatorships that the United States had been supporting before. It began in Pakistan with the removal of Musharraf and the attempt to bring in democracy with Benazir Bhutto. But as everyone knows, in Pakistan, Benazir Bhutto was assassinated and Pakistan descended into anarchy. Well, they took this policy of Israeli-style democracy and now imported it throughout the Middle East. And this is where Gaddafi, who was once an ally and supported and trained by the United States and the CIA, now became a foe of the CIA. And what was done under the UN? You had again this UN policy of dumping weapons into there and supporting these so-called rebels and freedom fighters under the guise that we would get a democratic government in there. And they were aiming more of a socialist type of thing. But that's not what happened. What happened was that you ended up having a lot of civilians killed. After Gaddafi was removed, you still are having civilians killed. They're still finding mass graves. But the weapons began to migrate and be pushed out of Libya into a lot of these other African countries. And one of the African countries that it was pushed into, the weapons that were pushed into, it was pushed into Mali. This is where the army was able to get more ammunition and more weapons and sort of take over and do the coup they did a couple weeks ago. But the problem is that the people who transported this themselves now are divided. The weapons were transported by a group named the Tuaregs. They are a desert-dwelling tribe, and their range goes all the way from Mali into Libya, across the Algerian into it. You know, there's a huge spread of this area there that they cover because they cover a large chunk of the Sahara. And they basically pushed all these weapons around. But the Tuareg now are amongst themselves divided. You have one group who wants a national identity in the north, and another group who are joining the Islamic group Al-Qaeda. In other words, they're becoming Islamists like the rest of these different groups across Nigeria, in Somalia, in Kenya, in Uganda. All this stuff is really sort of spilling over, and so now you're having a rebellion in the north that's threatening to pull Mali into a state of civil war, just the way we saw the way we're seeing now in Syria, just the way we're still seeing in Libya, and a lot of other places that have been destabilized across Africa. And this includes now Sudan, who the UN recently partitioned. Again, this whole partitioning thing at the plague there, and if you're wondering why the interest in Sudan and Uganda, well, just recently they found oil there. So this whole play, and this is where you're seeing the play in Libya for the separation of different things. Again, Libya, you're getting a separation of states in Libya, where you're having a lot of these different separate groups being supported by the UN, believing they're going to get a UN approval. Again, surrounds the oil installations. So the areas that have the oil installations, who are more Europeanized, want a separate state from those who are more African in the rest of the state, in the rest of the Libyan state. But this is while the dynamics are that you're having these groups come to a head, is being pushed by the socialist ideals that we're seeing coming out of the UN, that's being supported by Obama, and is part of this whole concept of visible and invisible minorities, where at one point in time the visible minority matters, and the invisible minority has to be eliminated and pushed out. Then another point, and they could be completely opposite groups. While the United States is fighting and going after Al Qaeda, and it will go after, and it will say, "Oh, you can't say this because you're supporting Al Qaeda," or they now have the private who was at the center of WikiLeaks on trial for treason because he gave out sensitive materials over the internet. They're at the same time in both Africa and in the Middle East, including in Syria, providing Islamist groups with weapons. When they dumped all those weapons into Libya, they knew that they were giving weapons to Al Qaeda groups. In Syria, the rebels, if you go back and you study who they are, and you go back and source their videos, you will find their videos, a large chunk of their videos, on jihadist sites. And you'll find the United States and the United Kingdom funding them. And you'll hear the rhetoric come from Ban Ki-moon of the UN now, echoing the calls from the US and the UK to really unseat and do a regime change in Syria, to try to bring in the same type of thing that they had in Libya and in Pakistan. What they're doing is they're going to try and destabilize Syria. And if you look at where Syria is situated geographically and why there's such an urgency, well, again, from Israeli media and inside of Israel, we see that there is a window of opportunity to attack Iran that Israel has, and that is by sometime in June. By June, that window starts to close, and they're going to need Syria to go through Syria in order to get at Iran. And a large chunk of this urgency so now these rebels have become the visible minority. They've been moved up from the invisible minority of being the Islamists, which they are. And you can see what they've done around the world in terms of how these Islamists treat their own people and their own women and children. And ask yourself, well, how can somebody do these things to the women and children? Well, don't forget, these Islamists, what these Islamists can and have done to their own women and children. All you have to do is look at Afghanistan to see this, or into Pakistan, right? The rape laws, how they punish the woman for being raped. And then look and see that in the same breath as they're talking about funding these Islamists inside of Syria and saying that these people are rebelling, that they want to be free, and this is about democracy and how they should be free, at the same breath they turn around and ignore and deny what's happening to the Palestinians inside Israel. And as I said, at this point in time, I'm no longer referring to Palestine as a separate state. It's Israel now. The two-state solution is over. Right now, what you have, and the way things have gone down on the ground, you've got two fundamental prison camps inside of Israel. You've got the West Bank, and you've got Gaza. And at this situation now, what you have in Israel is what we had in South Africa. Israel right now is an apartheid state. And this is not simply my opinion, but this is the opinion of many of the Israeli peace activists. That what's happened now is we've gone beyond simply an occupation into an apartheid state where there is one group who is visible. It can have all these rights and need to have all these rights and protections, and there is one group who is invisible and needs to be eliminated for the benefit and the overall greater good of the common of the society at large. So the Palestinians now are on this invisible elimination list, just the way babies are in the United States. just the way the Jews were in Auschwitz and Hitler in Germany, just the way a large chunk of non-communists and other ethnic groups were inside of the Soviet Union in terms of the number of people who died in Ukraine. All you do is look at the Ukrainian famine, see what happened there. Look at where the journalists were on this particular issue. You'll see how the journalists lined up and were complimentary to the Soviet government. You can even see in the 1980s a number of musicians, these forward-thinking musicians. In Queen, there is one song, I'll dig it up, where it says, and it's a song about one world, that if we give up, it won't hurt at all. That if we give up, we won't hurt at all. Even in John Lennon's song "Imagine," that's essentially a communist national anthem. It says, "Imagine no God, no government, no properties, no possessions." Okay, so let's imagine this: that I download the song "Imagine" and I start using it to promote my videos. Do you think that song is not going to be flagged under DCA? And you can see the hypocrisy. So you can see the hypocrisy now. You can see the hypocrisy in history. You can see where Obama is coming from. You can see where things are heading in terms if we keep Obama in the position. But here's where the counter argument is. What is the proposal? What is the argument on the right being presented by the Republicans? Unfortunately, a large chunk of the argument from the right is that a right extreme solution is the answer to the left extreme solution, and that's not the solution. That's not democracy. That is not bringing in balance. Bringing things into a more centered society that means bringing things more towards an individualist society where the individual rights are respected, that the state cannot oppress you because of your individual beliefs, and that you have rights and freedoms beyond what the government tells you do. In other words, rights and freedoms in an individualist society are defined by the individual and not by the government itself. And what I'll do is I'll be going over the next few months, from the next few weeks and months, over the philosophy and the theology behind it, how the theology emerges out from its initial core into the morality, and then from the morality into the Constitution and into laws. I guess I said everything sits within this context. If you're using the socialist model, you sit in the random, ambiguous model, because nothing in the world was created. Everything's an accident. Everything's random. So everything from this point out stays random. You cannot produce order from random. From randomness. You cannot get structure from a random structure. From randomness. So you can't go from chaos to structure. You can't go from randomness to order. This is something that's inherently contradictive. So I said I'll be going into more of this later on in the next coming episodes and next coming broadcasts of this report, and I'll also be doing working on new documentaries that will be coming up either next week or the week after. Anyways, this is it for tonight's show. Be careful. There's a lot of people out there telling you different things. Read for yourself. I have the link down below to the documentaries. There's now 4 up from the series Daniel Yergin's The Prize. You need to study this stuff. You cannot just simply sit. This is not a leisurely pursuit, unfortunately, because there is so much going on. There's so many lies out there. In order to dig for the truth, if you're interested in digging for the truth, then you need to lift up the covers. You need to be reading. You need to have an understanding of history, and that way everything will be put into context. So I'll see you later.
Free speech rules here at Democratic Earth.